When plagiarists steal a work, typically they don't really know what they have. And therefore, when they copy it over, sometimes they make a mistake and they don't realize they've made a mistake. Or they add something because they think it would sound better and it just blows the whole illusion of the thing. See, it shows that they really didn't know what they had. So I'm going to give 3 examples. I've run across a great many examples of this, actually. When I was thinking about how I was going to put this together, I got up at like 2:30 in the morning, couldn't go back to sleep with this idea in my head. And I thought of 5, 6, 7, 8 examples, and then I thought, well, let's stick to just 3 of the best ones, most interesting ones. So we're going to do that. I have to give a little background, but I don't think I'm going to give a whole lot here because I've done it before and it's in my books and my papers. So I'll just give the briefest of context here. Abby Poyen Whittier, Matthew's future wife, when she was 14, was a child prodigy in both poetry and in music. And she was tutoring Matthew. She was 4 years younger, but she had an upper class European style French education, which means that she was tutored not just in things that would be useful for marriage, like sewing and cooking and playing piano and stuff, but she also had a real liberal education. So Matthew desperately wanted an education. He couldn't get one, and Abby apparently stepped in and became his tutor and passed her education on to him. And in the process, she began falling in love with him. Well, she was, 12 or so when they started, and 14 when she wrote most of this poetry, which was plagiarized by her classroom teacher, Albert Pike. All of this I have painstakingly put together and written about. I won't try to prove anything here because we don't have time for the deep background that would be required to prove these things. But at age 14, she wrote a poem called Marriage, and somehow she got it submitted and published in a magazine that Matthew was writing reviews and essays for, which was called The Essayist. And I have an original copy. Everything we're going to be looking at today is from original antiquarian sources, which I think is kind of fun. This is The Essayist. Runs from 1831 to 1833. The editor was George W. Light. He was a friend of Albert Pike's. A lot of Abby's poems, or several of Abby's poems, ended up in here. Some of them were signed AP. They were claimed later and reworked by Albert Pike. They were not his. One of them is anonymous, which George W. Light later claimed and republished as his own. And this one we're going to look at, called Marriage, actually has George W. Light's initials, GWL, but it was never his. It was Abby broadly hinting that she wanted to marry Matthew someday and putting forth her ideals of marriage as a young lady of 14, as a precocious young lady of 14. Well, I'm not going to read the whole poem. This is in a February 32 edition of The Essayist, February 1832. But there's a line in here. She's talking about what happens when a soulmate couple, she's talking about a soulmate couple, even though it's called marriage. She's talking about what happens when they die. And in her mind, they die together and they go on to the higher astral spheres because she had studied high mysticism and the paranormal. She's a spiritualist and a mystic. And the poem reads, see, I'll back up a little bit. His spirit, speaking of God, his spirit leads them to the pastures green, where crystal streamlets freshly flow between and sparkle in the sun. And when their spirits leave this earthly home, left not to wander with not where to roam or seek a darker sphere, and it goes on like that. Well, not where to roam should have been with nowhere to roam. It's obvious. But it sounds poetical. I suppose it sounded poetical to George W. Light to render it with not where to roam. Well, in those days, nowhere would have been not contracted. It would have been 2 words, nowhere. Somehow or other, he copied it over as not where, and he kept it. Well, that's understandable if he might have done it in one, instance. But in 1853, he published a little compilation of poems, which I have here, called Lights, Keep Cool, Go Ahead, and a few other poems. One or two of these I think are his. Most of them are Abby's and Matthew's. Now, some of them are taken from the Essayist, but reworked. And not reworked in a good way. They're reworked in a less spiritual way. So they're dumbed down, in other words. But they're Abby's poems and Matthew's poems. So here, instead of marriage, we have heart union. This is on page 10 of this book, which was, I think I said it was published in 1853. And let's go down to this same section. It's hard to find. He's revised it quite heavily. And kindly luring to the pasture green, where crystal streamlets freshly flow between and sparkle in the sun. And when at last they seek their angel home, parentheses, left not to wander with not where to roam or find a darker sphere. Well, this, of course, this is spiritualism, because in her view, when someone dies, they can gravitate to a darker realm of the astral, or they can gravitate to the higher realms, see? But he's still got not where to roam, even though he's obviously modified it by putting that line in parentheses. So he didn't have any clue as to what this poem was about. He didn't even see the obvious mistake that he'd introduced into it. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. He reproduced that same mistake in 1853. So that's a bad error, and it clearly shows, in my opinion, that he was not the original author, which he wasn't. He was a kind of minor con artist like his friend Albert Pike. Now we're going to turn to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and it so happens I have here an original of one of the volumes of her 1844 English edition, which she called Poems, and in it is a poem called The Lost Bower, which was Matthew's poem. He apparently sent 2 or 3 or 4 poems to her in 1842. Apparently he had sent a couple of his and Abby's to her in 1838, and she just simply revised them and published them as her own. She was an imposter. She was not a truly inspired poet on her own right. When she wrote on her own, it was this highfalutin, long, intellectualized, insincere stuff that sounded kind of vaguely mystical. And then the good poems that she published were not hers. So here we have The Lost Bower, and it's, as I read it, it's what you might call an astral dimensional shift experience that Matthew had as a little boy, of finding himself in a magical realm, kind of an astral realm, and he never could find it again. And the reason that he wrote it in 1842 was that he would go through periods where he doubted the existence of the life after death, the astral realm, as Abby had taught him. And then he would go through periods where he would be convinced of it. He vacillated back and forth because his faith wasn't strong enough. So in The Raven, you see his skepticism winning out, his materialism winning out. And then in The Lost Bower, on the other hand, you see his mystical side winning out, because he remembered, gosh, I actually have experienced the astral realm as a boy. So of course it exists. See, so that's why it's there. It's a grief poem in a sense. But there's a line here where he's climbing a hill, apparently, and out in the woods. And he says, small the wood is, green with hazels, and completing the ascent, where the wind blows and sun dazzles, thrills in leafy tremblement, like a heart that, after climbing, beateth quickly through content. Well, Elizabeth Barrett Browning has written through content, when obviously it was like a heart that, after climbing, beateth quickly, should have been a comma, though content. Well, it can be argued, but I'm not the only one, because I found instances in history where one person ridiculed her for having written that, and somebody, like 2 other instances where people just changed it without saying anything because they knew it was wrong, see? Well, as far as I know, Elizabeth Barrett Browning never corrected this. There were later editions. She never said anything. She never corrected it. She never said, oh, I really made a dumb mistake there. She thought that's what Matthew had meant. She thought it sounded poetic, just like George W. Light thought it was poetic to say, left not to wander with not where to roam. See, she thought that beateth quickly through content, as though content was a noun. She thought that was poetical sounding, see? So it's proof positive that she didn't write that poem, in my opinion. Now, proof positive takes an open mind, one, and two, it takes context, takes background. So in a short video, by definition, I can't give you the context. You have to get that by going back and reading my books and my papers, see? And if you don't do that, then you can't say that you have dismissed this, because I'm only kind of giving you the results. I'm not giving you the background as to how I got the results, and I can't give it to you. I can give you some of it, but then you'll pretend that that's all of it and dismiss it, see? Oh, he gave the background and it wasn't enough. See, well, of course it wasn't enough, because I can't give you 2,290 pages worth of background like I have in my books. Anyway, I think that's kind of an interesting example. And furthermore, if I look at Matthew Franklin Whittier's correspondence from this same period that he would have written this poem, 1842, I find that he was writing T-H-O-U-G-H or T-H anything with a weird kind of an H that was a two-part H that had like a vertical and then another vertical. It sometimes didn't get connected. And you can see that somebody not familiar with his handwriting could indeed interpret that as through, T-H-R-O-U-G-H, instead of though, So that's another little clue there. Now we're going to turn to A Christmas Carol. And here I have my 19th century rebound 1844 copy, as I gather and I understand, of A Christmas Carol. This would have been the edition that Matthew himself would probably have gotten hold of when it came to the United States. And here we have the end of it. Now, in my opinion, the next to last paragraph was written by Matthew and Abby. The last paragraph was added by Dickens because he just didn't feel that the last one was good enough, and he had something else he had to say, so he added his own last paragraph. And I'm going to show you why I think that. It's not just coming out of my head. See, I've got some evidence for this. So I'm going to read it. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. That's the second to last paragraph that Matthew wrote. Now here's, here's Dickens' edition. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the capital's total abstinence principle ever afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, capitals, God bless us, every one. Now, let's analyze that. First of all, the good old city, good old town, that's Matthew's language. And I've got examples to prove that. It's not that Dickens didn't use the term good old, but he didn't use it this way nearly as much as Matthew did. But that I've gone into in my books. Now, this business about some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh and little heeded them. Now, Matthew wrote autobiographically. I don't know that Charles Dickens did. I don't think he did. But had he done so, this would not be a match for Charles Dickens. because nobody was laughing at Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was famous. He was a rock star, a literary rock star. He was accustomed to lauds and honors. He was lionized, as they called it back then. Matthew, on the other hand, being a literary genius, a real one, was very badly marginalized, and people laughed at him. And they laughed at him and Abby, because Abby was persecuted as a witch. Both of them were persecuted for being abolitionists. And in general, Matthew was kind of looked down upon as a writer because he had a famous brother. See, his older brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, was the man of letters of the Whittier family. And ever since a little boy, Matthew was not taken seriously as a writer. He was interested in satire. He studied very carefully and deeply studied the satirists of Europe of the last couple centuries. But his mother didn't take that kind of writing as serious literature. So even from a little boy, he wasn't taken seriously, but he was a humorist. So he had learned to just laugh it off. This is not relevant to Scrooge, because Scrooge had gone from being a selfish, cruel miser to being a generous, loving person. Well, it's possible that for a day or two, somebody might laugh at him, dancing around saying that, the spirits did it all in one night in his, nightgown. But that would have been it. Nobody would have continued laughing at him for having turned over a new leaf and being a generous person, see? So it's not a fit for the character. It's not a fit for Charles Dickens. It's a perfect fit for Matthew Franklin Whittier. This second paragraph, now what you have to understand is that the opening to this story was written by people who were spiritualists, who sincerely believed in spirits, and who were writing as though to skeptics. This is not a ghost story, and it was not written by a skeptic, which Dickens was, taking the imaginative part of a believer. This was written by real believers. So when you get to the opening of this book and you read, Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, etc., etc. That is a believer addressing skeptics. That is not a skeptic pretending for the sake of a ghost story to be a believer. Well, you have to understand that before you understand the ending. These people would most certainly not have sworn off spirit contact as though swearing off of alcohol, which is Dickens' clear inference here. He wrote that because it would go over better with his Christian audience. He could only sell this story to traditional Christians if he couched it as a ghost story, which was not real. And at the end, if he made Scrooge disavow all further contact with spirits. But the original authors would never have written it. So that's pretty strong evidence in itself, but that's not all we have. It so happens there are two instances of Matthew Franklin Whittier writing an almost identical ending in precursor works. And both of these came from well before A Christmas Carol was published, but it's a little tough to prove. And again, I can only give a little bit of the background. I've gone into this before several times. Two men, one of whom Matthew had ghostwritten for, Francis A. Duravage and George Pickering Burnham, apparently approached Matthew in mid-1848 and got him to sign a bogus contract, which in the fine print turned over the complete rights to Matthew's entire unpublished portfolio of two different kinds of work. One of them was humorous anecdotes based on real life and a real either his life or observed life. And the other one was swashbuckling romantic foreign adventure tales. Well, in two of these, stories, the humorous stories, there appears endings which are almost identical or very, very similar to the endings that Matthew used for A Christmas Carol, see, the one that they wrote, the second to last paragraph. And I'm going to read both of them. So Durivage published these in different publications. Primarily it was Gleason's Pictorial, The Flag of Our Union, or then Ballew's Pictorial, which all were in the same line because the first two were owned by Frederick Gleason, and then this one was bought out from Frederick Gleason. When Maturin Ballew bought out this magazine from Frederick Gleason and became the owner, he hired Francis A. Durivage as an assistant associate editor. And Durivage immediately proceeded to publish one of Matthew's novels that was in that portfolio. That's another story. But here, we're going to go to the April 21st, 1855 edition. And I will show you what this looks like. I can't hold it up with the spine open, but this is, there it is, Ballew's Pictorial, Volume 8. Hit the computer, sorry. And this is called A Story of Old Times. It's a story of a miser who turns over a new leaf. And I'm going to read you the ending. He was as good as his word, and from a miserly, surly old curmudgeon, Harman Brinkerhoff became, to the astonishment of all who knew him, one of the most genial of the Knickerbockers. So there we have one of them. Now let's look at another one. This one, I don't know where it was first published, if it was first published in a newspaper or magazine, but it ended up in a compilation published by Francis Durivage in 1853 called The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. Here it is. And way toward the back, we have a story called The New Year's Bells. And with bells on, this is a very, very tight precursor to A Christmas Carol. You probably don't believe me. I suggest reading it. You can find this book online. I think you can find it in the archive.org or the Hathi Trust. Either one have this. And go back and look at the New Year's Bells and read it for yourself, because I'm not just blowing smoke when I say this is a very close precursor to A Christmas Carol. I mean, either this was flagrantly plagiarized by Francis Durivage after A Christmas Carol was written and published, or this is a real genuine precursor work. And Durivage didn't write this. I guarantee I can prove it. So I'm not going to go through everything. I've gone through quite a bit of it in my paper, but I'm just going to read the ending. These would have been written around 1830, 1831, 1832, somewhere in there. This character's name is Israel Worm. This is the precursor to Ebenezer Scrooge. Israel was as good as his word and never relapsed into his old habits. The widow and the orphan children were provided for by his bounty. He gave liberally to every object of charity. Hospitals, schools, and colleges were the recipients of his bounty. And when he died, in the fullness of years, the blessings of old and young followed him to his last resting place in the old churchyard, where he had dreamed the mysterious dream and been awakened to a better life by the pealing of the New Year's bells. Well, that's all I want to present today. It's not all I have. I have a ton of other examples, but I think that's enough for now. These plagiarists, by definition, they'd be writing their own work if they were capable of understanding this work they're stealing. See? So a plagiarist's best work, by definition, is not going to be his or hers. And they'll make mistakes because they don't understand it. So if they miscopy something, or they just get the idea that something else ought to be in there, they'll add it, and you can see that it's nowhere near the same quality. And it doesn't evince any real deep understanding of what the piece was about. There's a bunch of examples of that. There's a double ending on Some Words with a Mummy. that Edgar Allan Poe stole from Matthew Franklin Whittier that's kind of along the same lines. Because Matthew many times wrote about quack medicine. And that story originally, I think, was intended as a dig at quack doctors. But Poe saw fit to put in some other ending, which Matthew would never have done because it implies that the man doesn't care about his family and is going to leave his children and just doesn't care about them, see, which a sociopath would think that was funny. So there's other examples, but these are enough, you know. So I don't know. I mean, you can tell my frustration in all of this because these things are so obvious. And yet people will not admit that I'm right, see. They just will not give me the satisfaction. And recently, I think Abby was pointing it out to me. She prompted me to watch a film. Sometimes she does, and usually they're meaningful. She did this when we first got together. And I know I'm destroying my credibility completely with anybody that's watching, but I don't care, you know, at this point. And this was a very strange movie about a fellow who was a decorated war hero, and he still had a little bit of time before he was going to be discharged. So they gave him the duty of visiting new widows and widowers to tell them, to announce to them that their loved one had died in combat. See, horrible job. I mean, you can just imagine. And it shows the two of them and what happens and the reactions that they get. And I didn't understand why Abby would have prompted me to see that movie. And then it hit me. I realized this is what I'm doing to people. Telling people that Charles Dickens was a scoundrel and had plagiarized A Christmas Carol and never wrote that to begin with and lied about the way that he supposedly wrote it is like showing up on the door and telling somebody that their husband has just died in combat. And you've got to expect those kind of reactions. In the movie, you know, they get slapped, they get stuff thrown at them, they get punched, you know, because people can't take it. And they shoot the messenger. They literally attack the messenger in their grief. Well, that's kind of like what happens to people. I mean, that's why I got that scathing review from somebody that rejected my paper about Charles Dickens for a journal. It wasn't rational. Her response was irrational, but you can kind of understand it because, I mean, look what you're asking them to accept. I mean, for one thing, they've spent a whole life writing, probably from their dissertation on, writing and teaching about how and why Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. And I'm undermining the entire thing. You know, it's a shock to which they just can't recover. Leastwise, not right away. But what I do find is that people are silently looking. There's a whole IP address that is looking at it now in Oregon over and over and over and over at all times of the day and night. I'm seeing people from this one little area in Oregon looking at this paper. Now, hardly anybody reads it unless they're downloading it. So I have to assume that either they're looking at the title page or else they're actually downloading it and reading it at their leisure. But I don't know how many there have been so far, 20, 25, you know, hits from this one IP address. So they're looking at it. And it's like, I say it's like a magic trick that people know it's got to be phony, can't be real, but how did he do it? They can't figure out how he did it, how he made the thing disappear or, you know, levitate or whatever it is. It can't be real, but they just can't figure it out. So they keep going back and back and back and looking at it and looking at it. And I took a quick look at that paper today when I was looking up this particular evidence, and it's a good paper. It has like 14 footnotes. The reviewer said, oh, there are hardly any footnotes. Well, there's 14. How many do they want? You know, there's nobody for me to reference because there's nobody that's figured this out. So there's nobody for me to cite that's relevant. The only citations I can give are primary sources, which I do. It's a good paper, and there's strong, compelling evidence in it, which I've just given you a little tiny piece. And if you read that story, if you get into archive.org or the Hathi Trust and actually read the New Year's bells, and you understand that that was Matthew Franklin Whittier, probably back around 1830 or 31 or 32, was not Francis A. Durivage, you know, you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of how compelling this evidence is. So there's no problem with my evidence. There's no problem with my sanity. There's no problem with my intelligence. The problem is that people can't take it, which, I've kind of made my peace with in a way because I put myself in their shoes and I can understand it. It's very difficult to accept a radical paradigm shift that tears your own reality right like down the middle like a piece of paper. I understand it. But on the other hand, I've gone to a lot of trouble, you might say, incarnating, figuring out who I was, researching this thing, finding Matthew's legacy, painstakingly piecing it together, archiving it, writing about it. I've gone to a lot of trouble to reclaim my past life legacy as Matthew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier's legacy. And so long as people think that these plagiarists were the real authors, I'm not going to be able to preserve that legacy. So I really am forced to prove these things and to wrest these pieces out of the hands of these thieves and reestablish them as Matthew and Abby's work. And that's what I intend to do.